Okay, hello everybody. I'm Matthew Newton. I thought just spend a bit of time looking at some of the logging requirements of eduroam, because there are logging requirements in the specifications. Some ideas about how you configure FreeRADIUS, and looking at the FreeRADIUS 4 possibilities and new things that are coming on there. Things about storing logs, all things log related. It's a technical talk, it's not GDPR. I know everyone's talking about GDPR. I don't understand it all, so I might say something you're not allowed to do these days. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. Hopefully you've got somebody to advise you on that one. So we need all the logs. Primarily, I guess it's operational reasons. People need logs. You need to work out what's gone wrong, what's happening, what's working out wherever somebody comes along because my device doesn't connect, what's gone wrong there, and you can only find out if you've got logs of what's been happening, whether that's radius logs or whatever other logs. There are rules. Janet Network has rules on what logs you have to keep on who's using the network, and the eduroam tech spec has rules and requirements on what you have to keep, which I read through the other evening, which is terribly exciting. I'm sure everyone reads it through regularly to make sure you're up to date with the latest version. You have to keep the date and time of each event in Radius, the inner and outer username from EAP, calling station ID, operator name, chargeable user identity, whether the result was accepted or rejected, and if it was rejected, why the authentication was rejected, and then the NAS IP address, DHCP logs IP and MAC address, and any NAT mappings. And that was everything I managed to find in the bits of the tech spec that seem to be listed of all the logs you need to keep. But do we need all of the logs is the question. So I know when I started, and I had FreeRADIUS 2 at the time, and it was a really confusing situation. You've got this new software, it's massive, it does all sorts of things, and it's really confusing. Panic, what do I do? Okay, there's this detail logger. I'll just chuck it in all over the place and it just logs everything. And you're looking on disk and you've got the logs for every single request that comes through the server. You've got all the accepts, all the rejects. And then you realise you're missing something because you've not got the actual username that was in the EAP request. So therefore you look around and you find, there's the inner tunnel. I'll add detail logs in there as well because then I get the username. And so for each authentication request, you're getting loads and loads of logs. And it's a very naive approach, but you start somewhere. But obviously with EAP, you've got many round trips on each authentication. Might be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 round trips. Each one of those, if you log them all, it's a lot of data and it's stuff that you don't need. It takes more storage. It's harder to find things. When you've got detailed logs of the inner and of the outer auth, you might get an authentication happen, but then you'll get the request come in, you might log that somewhere, you'll get the response go back, that's logged somewhere else. Trying to tie all these together can get quite difficult, and especially the default logs in FreeRADIUS, and you look at the attributes in the lists, just the way Radius is, you won't get, say, the calling station ID won't be in the accept or reject, so you don't know which MAC address it was that you logged. So it's looking at tying all these things together. So do we just keep the auth logs? That's what the actually is. If you read through the eduroam tech spec, that's basically what's in there. You have the authentication logs. It's smaller. There's just the requirement to log who's on the network. But there's also your Janet requirements of extra data about MAC addresses and IP addresses, tying them together. So then you think, well, okay, I'll just keep the accounting logs, which actually could be all right. You know who's been let onto your network, but then you don't know if one of your own users has gone to another site and logged in. You'll never see the accounting logs because they don't go across eduroam anymore. They're not forwarded. So you end up finding that you have to keep basically the authentication logs and the accounting logs and the DHCP logs, so you can tie them all together. You find the accounting logs might have things like the amount of data that's transferred might be useful for debugging, or if you're monitoring stats on the users, where the user's connected, which access point they joined to. You might get signal strengths on some controllers maybe. All these logs. So you basically need to keep logs from all over the place. But how do you keep small amounts of logs? Keep fewer logs. I would say keep as minimal logs as you can to satisfy the requirements. Keep logs in a central location. Don't keep them on the Radius servers. Makes it a lot easier to deal with them and to work with them. And just logging the replies, whether somebody is allowed on or not, isn't enough. Because if you read through the tech spec, it does say you need to know whether an authentication failed. So you could say, I'll just put a detail logging in my access accept and access reject. I've covered it. But you haven't, because you don't then know if somebody tried to log onto the network and something went wrong. Quite often you have certificate problems in EAP, and usually the client doesn't like the server or something like this, drops off in the middle, and if you're only logging on the accept or the reject, then you never see the authentication, so it makes it very hard to diagnose what's happening. So way back in FreeRADIUS version 2, you could look at the incoming request to determine the first packet in the EAP sequence. So you've obviously got, say, 7, 8 times 9 round trips. The first packet comes in is an EAP response, which is an identity. And that's the only packet in the entire authentication that's an EAP identity. So you could actually look in the authorized section in FreeRADIUS. So you can say the first thing you do is, okay, look at the EAP message. Is it an EAP identity packet? Yes. Okay, I'll log that and say there's somebody trying to log in now. It's beginning of an authentication session. And that will only happen the first time round. So the way that looks like is something like this, which is rather hacky. You can just do a regular expression on the EAP message and say if it's a response, which is the O2, and if it's an identity, then line log or detail or whatever you like. Which then means you can log your requests, so you see when somebody's logging in, but you don't need to log all of them. So that saves a load of logging, rather than logging every single request that comes in. But so it's not great. It's running a regular expression on the EAP message each time. So in V4 and also in V3, there's a new attribute list. So you have the attribute lists, normally the request, reply, and the control lists. You might have come across the session state list in FreeRADIUS. And that is created when the first packet comes in on the EAP session, and that's maintained through all of the round trips until the final accept or reject. So if you look at that when the first packet comes in, if that list is empty, you can then say, oh, okay, this is the first packet that's come in, that list, the session state list is empty, therefore I know this is the first packet, so I'll do a log. Nearly equivalent to the V2 config. That's the issue with this is if you don't ever put anything in the session state list, then obviously it's empty every single time round. So to get around that issue, we'll change our config slightly here, and so we say receive access. This is the V4 syntax has changed. So rather than the authorized section, we've now got receive access request. We say receive access request if not session state. So if the session state list is empty, then the first thing we do is update the session state and stick something in there, stick an attribute in it, and then we do the logging, and then we continue on to whatever else we were going to do. I've picked here for the temp integer 64.1. This is actually calculating the time in milliseconds of the current request, which can be useful later. The %C and the lowercase %c and uppercase %c expansions are only in version 4. So if you're doing this in version 3, then you have to change what you're logging there. But that's going to basically store the time that the first request came in the session state list. Then in the inner tunnel, on an access accept or an access reject, we can then update the outer session state. So it's not the session state in the inner, it's the outer session state with the inner username. So because obviously normally the radius request comes in with an outer username, that's not going to contain necessarily the actual username that's being used to log in. That's in the inner tunnel inside EAP. So you can take that username, push it into the session state of the outer, so you've then got that available in the outer. Calling station ID, called station ID, these things are in the outer already, so that's not a problem. You just have to be careful when you're updating the outer session state or copying things from the inner to the outer of any privacy that's involved in that. So if you copy the username from the inner to the outer, then obviously that's now available. If you then went off and proxied that off somewhere else, you could potentially make that attribute available. So if you do this, then make sure you filter the attributes on the outer or delete them before you do anything else with the packet. It makes it easier for logging, but you just have to be careful with what you do with the attributes. So we've stored in the outer, we've stored the time, in this case, but we've done a log when the first request came in, stored the time in the list so that there's at least something in the session state list. Loads of packets go through, backwards and forwards, setting up the EAP tunnel. We've now hit the inner tunnel, we've hit the accept or the reject, so in this case the accept. So we've then stored the outer, stored the username. And then in the outer, so the default server, when you send the accept or the reject there, Here I'm updating the first line here, a control attribute, just to say accept, just to say what happened. Updating the session state and now calculating the time again, so you can see where this is going. We've now got the time the first packet came in and the time when we accepted or rejected. And then here in the update control, we're taking the one off the other. So we can actually calculate the latency of something that happened. That's very convenient with v4 because you've got these extra attributes. You can obviously do arithmetic on different things. So that gives us now a single log when the first packet came in from the first authentication, and then a single log at the end. The one at the beginning is useful because it tells you that somebody tried to log in, but if something went wrong in the meantime, then you've still got a log of the fact that they tried. You wouldn't have an accept or reject at the end. And then the log at the end, hopefully that's what you're getting. You'll have in this temp string 1, we've now got an accept which we can log, and then we've got the time and other data that's in there. And then we've got a line login as an example here. So essentially that looks like touching the config in these 5 places. It's the receive access request, so that's the authorized section in v3, and then send accept and reject in the outer, and send accept and reject in the inner, just to copy the required data from the inner back to the outer. So these are then pretty much the things that are attributes that are useful to log. We've got in version 4, we've got a new expansion, or a changed expansion %t, which is now the ISO time, including the milliseconds. So you've got a fairly accurate time of when something happened. Then we've updated the control with a temporary string, which has then just got request, accept or reject, so then you know what the type of logging was that you were doing there. And then all of the other attributes we've been updating. Session state module failure message, the default config will update module failure message with what's the reason is when something's gone wrong. So that covers off your tech spec requirement of when something goes wrong, you need to log Y. So hopefully that should be in that attribute there. And then operator name and username. And then we've got which is not required, but then we've got our control temp integer 64 as well. So we've got the authentication time. The reason I was looking at that is one of the issues I've hit in the past is when, especially it's a university setting, students, I'm sure you've all seen it, the students are all in a lecture at whatever time, and every hour you get a massive peak on your Radius server because they all stand up and they all walk out of the room and their phones jump onto every single access point they walk past until they sit down their next lecture, and you get these spikes on the hour. And that used to cause us problems with NTLM auth and AD, which I've probably talked about before, I'm sure. So this is a really convenient thing now that you could actually use these expansions in v4 with the milliseconds, calculate the times before. So this is doing it for the entire heap, so obviously right from the very first packet all the way through to the end. You could put something similar around just your authentication. So you could stick it around your call to NTLM auth or your call to winbind or whatever you're doing, and just time that. So if you suspect that something is taking a bit long and you think, I'm pretty sure it's the AD that's being slow, or the talking to AD that's being slow in this case, you can measure that now, which was hard to do before because you had down to a second, which didn't really help. And I know some people have updated, put wrappers around the NTLM auth script to try and log times on that, but this is another way you can do that. Second half now, really. This is now you've got the logs rather than line log, looking at just ways of. I've always thought it's best to try and centralise the logs as much as possible, keep them in one place rather than spread on the Radius servers. And I've been there, I've seen that you have 3 Radius servers, you've got logs all over on all of the servers. Something goes wrong, you've got to find it, and you end up having to do cluster SSH into all the servers or something and try and grep through logs to try and find things, and it's not nice. So it's a lot easier if the logs are all in one place. It's a lot easier for records management if your logs are all in one place, rotating the logs. You don't end up with logs being backed up on your server backups, which might be an issue then, depending on if you want to keep the logs for a certain amount of time and the servers are backed up for longer or shorter. So it feels like the best way to go. There's many options of how you store your logs. You could, in simplest, just use line log and detail log. Detail modules have got options to syslog. That's an easy way of getting logs. If you put all the attributes in a single line in line log, fire them off to a syslog server, at least you've got them all in one place. It's easy to grep. Not necessarily reliable unless you're using a TCP syslog or something like that. You use SQL, Postgres or something like that, push them into a database. Harder to query unless you've got some sort of interface you need to query the data. Splunk, Elasticsearch, VMware Logs Insight, I think, lets you do things like this. So lots of different options, and you find the best things that works for you. Personally, I like Elasticsearch. It's free software, except for the hardware, and the hardware requirements are fairly beefy sometimes. It's got a good interface. Log rotation is easy. Each day is stored as a separate index. So when you get to the end of your 90 days or whatever you want, however long you want to keep, you just drop an entire day's worth. That's it, gone, and you don't have to worry about doing SQL select to delete past this particular data or something like that. And the really nice thing is that you can then take your different logs from different places and feed them all into the same place. So you can take your radius logs, your DHCP logs, wireless controller logs, any network access logs, all sorts of different things, feed them into the same place. So then you can when you're querying, and you probably had the situation before where something goes wrong and you think it's the radius side, but you're not sure, or are they getting an IP address from DHCP, or which bit was it that went wrong? And you're looking through your radius logs, you're looking through your DHCP logs, then you realise actually it was neither of those, it was the wireless. They just haven't got a signal from the access point, and you're actually having to dig through the wireless access controller logs and trying to find it in there. So it's really convenient to be able to feed them into one place, just search for a MAC address, and everything to do with that one person and that device all comes up in one screen, which is why I quite like that as a solution. So I just want to have a look at a few different ways of getting logs from FreeRADIUS into Elasticsearch. This is the easiest way, so you can go from FreeRADIUS, write detail logs out to disk. You can then parse them into logstash, write a config in logstash to pull the detail logs in, and that will then feed them into Elasticsearch. You've then got the issue of taking the detail logs from your radius servers, obviously they're just written out to disk, and feeding them across the network somehow into your logstash server, which isn't necessarily a big problem, but it's something else to think about. But you end up with a config something like this in logstash. This is in the FreeRADIUS 3 repository and in FreeRADIUS 4, so it's easy to find. The details files are quite useful because they act as a buffer. So if you have, this is always something I've found with logs, if you want to make sure it's a guaranteed, I've got to keep these. So if you write them out to disk, that's definitely, they're on disk. Something's got to then read them off, and you've got a copy of what happened. If something goes wrong with your log reader, you've still got the logs. So that is a bonus of this thing. The downside is parsing the detail files, coming up with the magic in there to get the right pattern and the options on the multi-line. Because detail logs are many lines, it's harder to parse them than just like a single line. You're just pulling off that and, that's the next log, or that's the next log. So there are downsides to that approach. But it works, and I've run that for a few years, and that's a good solution. That works with version 2, 3 and 4. It's just taking detail files, so not a problem. This one is, you can take FreeRADIUS, you could feed that into Redis, say, and then from Redis you can then feed that into logstash, and again into Elasticsearch. It's quite fast because you've got Redis as your buffer, you've just got to write it to Redis, which is an in-memory database. You can run Redis as a cluster to feed the data in. You don't have to now bother about shipping the detail files around, so it gets around that problem, which is quite nice. In FreeRADIUS, a way of pushing the data in is just to use the RLM Redis module. And so this example here is just calling an exlat to do an L push into a list. So the list is called radius : event, in this case, pick whatever you like. And that's generating some JSON data. So we're having to quote different attributes just to make sure that they're safe to go into JSON. But that will then push the essential data into a list in Redis. Once that's in Redis, you can then use a logstash config, so like this, which is similar to then pull the data out of Redis, and that will just sit there quite happily. Just when something appears on the list, it'll just take it off one at a time. You can also use the pub/sub features of Redis. So actually, when you in FreeRADIUS, rather than pushing entry onto a list, you just say publish this, and then anything that's listening to your Redis server does subscribe to the same channel, and they just get the message. It does work well, not necessarily good for logs, because if things stop subscribing to that channel, then they'll still get published and then they just get dropped on the floor because nothing's listening. So it's a possibility. Maybe if you're doing latency and you want to check how long things take, but you don't actually really care too much if something goes wrong, whether you lose it or not, that might be an option to then just shove that data across into Redis and just publish it, and then if things are listening to the stats, you can hear it. And then something that's working in v4, I haven't tried it in v3, it might work in v3, it definitely won't work in v2, is you can actually now feed directly from FreeRADIUS straight into Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch works quite nicely as it takes JSON data, so you can format that in FreeRADIUS. You can use the RLM REST module to contact Elasticsearch over its REST port, push the JSON data across. You get data back when you've done that to say whether it's successful or not. So having done that, you can then check the return in FreeRADIUS and make sure the event was logged before you continue or take whatever policy decisions you want to. So what does that look like in FreeRADIUS? This is it's the authorized section of the RLM REST config. Now, this is some of the things are changing. The things are changing from, say, receive, access, request, or whatever, from authorize. In the modules, a lot of the modules are still using the old names at the moment. Things are still in flux. So this is still the authorized section in the REST config. But we're saying connect to that particular URI. So this radius there is the index name in Elasticsearch. That's not using a daily index actually. That's just it's a one complete index for everything. Pushing some JSON, body is JSON that's pushing into it. Force to plain here just says when the data comes back, shove it into a REST HTTP body attribute, and then we'll deal with it ourselves. Don't try and parse the data that comes back, otherwise the REST module will look at the data that comes back, try and understand the JSON, and try and decode it into attributes for you, which it won't be in the right format JSON to do. So you'll say, we'll keep it as plain format, we'll cope with it ourselves. That will then take the data, whatever you've put in that data option, push that across to Elasticsearch. That will hopefully index it, and we'll come back with some JSON that looks something like this, which says that the piece in the middle is the important thing, result created. So that's what you want to be looking for. That can then be parsed in FreeRADIUS. So then in v4, and only in v4, there's the RLM JSON module. So we can now use the new map feature in v4 and say we want to look at the REST HTTP body attribute, use the JSON path, so $.result and $._shards.total, that will then map them, parse that data out of the JSON and put it into those attributes for you. So then once that's been done, you can then check to see whether that was created or not. So you've then got a policy decision, oh, my logging didn't happen, I need to know who's on the network, this is a bad thing, okay, in this case I'm going to not let them on, or I'm going to log it somewhere else. I might then push it into a detailed log to then come back again later and deal with it at another time. So it's quite a flexible solution. You've got more from V2 when you had just the detail logs and you just fire off the logs to disk, and that's it. You assume they've been written. Then now you've got control over, well, okay, I've not got to worry about my disk getting full and everything falling over. I can try and push them into Elasticsearch, say, in this way. When that's come back, okay, I know it wasn't logged. Now let's try and syslog it somewhere else, or now let's log it to disk, and we don't have to worry too much about what happens when things go wrong. And then, if anyone's seen Elasticsearch, you've then got options. The data's in there. You can use Kibana, which is the standard interface for looking at Elasticsearch. You can point something like Grafana at it. So if you've managed to put lots of latency stats or numbers and things in there, that's quite good for plotting values and plotting events over time. Timeline is the one on the right. That's part of Kibana as well. It's similar to Grafana, similar sort of features. Essentially, it's in a search engine. Then it's in a database. You've got all sorts of options about what you want to see. You can write scripts to just pull the data out. In fact, I wrote a script in the past to then take the data that was in Elasticsearch and dump it out essentially in detail format. So you can actually go the other way around and say, okay, I've logged all my data, it's in my database, but I now want to parse it as a detail format. Okay, let's just go the other way and pull it out and format it as detail files. So that's it really, a summary. Looking at the eduroam logging requirements, shouldn't log too much. Try and keep it to just what you need. Save some disk space. It's better for possibly legal issues and things. Just keeping the minimal amount of data you need. Keeping the central location is a good thing to do, I think, and there are several ways of doing that. And then some of the new features in v4 like maps and RLM-JSON and things we've had a look at. Aaron's written a good page on the FreeRADIUS wiki about setting up eduroam, which if you've not seen that, that's a good look. I'm going to try and write up some of these notes from this as well and put them on there, or a link from there at least.